Heathrow Airport, Monday, April 8, 1968. It's a fine spring afternoon in London. The sun is shining, the skies only partly cloudy. Still a cool temperature of 10 degrees Celsius with a very light breeze from the southwest. Heathrow is one of the busiest airports in the entire world. Countless numbers of planes come and go every day. Well-wishers gather at the observation deck to catch a glimpse of the birds. One of those spectators that day was 22-year-old Coleen Mahon. She had been at Heathrow Airport to see off some friends. Sometime after 4 p.m, she swings by Terminal 2 to watch the planes. The airport is noticeably quiet, or at least there is no movement of the planes. Those on final approach are flying away. From the corner of the south side of the airport, a plane does emerge into view. Much to the shock of those on the observation deck, it's on fire. Coleen pulls out her camera, snapping this photograph of the burning plane as it reaches the airport. Stunned bystanders can only watch as the plane slowly comes to a halt, only for it to explode with a thundering roar. Within seconds, the machine lays hollowed, burnt out in a raging inferno. How did this happen? Well, behind BOAC Flight 712 is both a simple explanation and a fatally complicated series of events that, while terrifying, is often remembered for the incredible achievements of the crew and the brave, courageous efforts of one lone flight attendant. The Boeing 707 was one of those airplanes that truly revolutionized the aviation industry of its day. Its strengths, built on the previous decades of innovation, cemented its place in aviation history. Entering service in 1958, it may not have been the first passenger jetliner, but it was the defining aircraft that guided aviation into the jet age. With its 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, the 707 balanced speed and comfort with range and performance, optimizing long-distance air travel unlike any other plane that came before it, reshaping the industry forever. For Boeing, a company that at the time had middling success in the passenger market, instead supported by strong military presence, the 707 was quite the endeavor, a huge stride forward passing the competition, namely Douglas and Lockheed in technological prowess, beating them to building a jet, though Douglas was not far behind. Over 1,000 707s were produced across all variants, including civilian and military models, making it the most successful airliner of its era. Its reach far extended beyond its home in the United States, spreading its wings to far-flung nations all over the world. And one of those countries was, interestingly enough, the United Kingdom. Britain in the 20th century had an aircraft manufacturing industry that was at the cutting edge of innovation. For example, the British are credited as having developed the first passenger jetliner, the de Havilland Comet, and British airplane makers continued to push boundaries in other areas, like the Hawker Siddeley Trident with its then state-of-the-art autoland function and its weird moving map thingy. However, getting the Boeing 707 into British skies was not so simple, if not controversial on multiple fronts. To begin with, there was the matter of politics. A protectionist outlook towards the British aviation industry lent itself to a government that was apprehensive about allowing foreign airplane manufacturers to take a slice out of the country's cake. This also coinciding with a patriotic Buy British mentality that spurred consumers into buying British goods to boost the domestic economy of the country in a dwindling British Empire. Now, in the mid to late 1950s, the Americans with their new 707s and DC-8s were readying to take to the skies, and British air carriers want in. That said, because Britain already had an airplane manufacturing industry, there was great emphasis on British air carriers buying British, and Westminster did get into a bit of a spat over this. Why should we purchase American planes? We already have a jet, the Comet. Well, sort of. We encourage our airlines to commit to more Comet orders, but also one of our British companies should build an airliner that can compete with the 707. Well, the closest the British would ever come to a Boeing 707 competitor came in the form of Vickers Armstrong's 4-engine rear-mounted T-tail Vickers VC-10. a plane with similar range capabilities as the 707, developed for hot and high Empire routes. The VC-10 is a complicated plane that had its own issues, and sales ultimately weren't impressive. We'll talk about it some other time. Oh goodness, will we ever? So, as the world was gearing up for the launch of the 707, there really wasn't a British plane on the market that could compete with the new American jet. The Comet had been withdrawn from service with a safety record in tatters due to its problems. A newer model of the Comet 4, was in development, but wouldn't be ready until 1958, and even then, its capacity, range, and lower cruise speed by comparison wasn't going to keep up with the 707. Moreover, the VC-10 was still a number of years away from becoming a reality. And it's within this framework that BOAC steps in. That's the British Overseas Airways Corporation. BOAC was the state-owned airline of the United Kingdom, with a hub at London Heathrow. The airline existed up till 1974, when it was eventually folded into the British Airways amalgamation. BOAC took a liking to the 707 ever since Boeing test pilot Tex Johnston famously performed 2 barrel rolls in the prototype to a crowd of stunned onlookers. In 1956, BOAC went to the British government, stressing that they needed this plane to stay competitive with American Airlines and Pan Am on long hauls, especially the London to New York route. Now, around this time, Rolls-Royce had been working on a new type of engine, building on the developing concept of bypass air. BOAC was able to make the case to the government that if they were to cut a deal with Boeing to fit the 707 with these British-manufactured engines from Rolls-Royce, then this would significantly boost the economy of the 707. This was the engine that Rolls-Royce had built. They called it Conwy. The name, to be clear, is an anglicised derivative of Conwy, which is the Welsh name given to a small town and river in Wales. Rolls-Royce have had this long tradition of naming their engines after rivers, and well, they chose this one on this occasion. The Conwy was the world's first production turbofan engine that introduced the component of bypass air. Compared to Pratt & Whitney's turbojets, which Boeing had employed thus far, the Conwy had a greater thrust output, whilst also being more fuel efficient. They allowed the plane to fly further, they were quieter, weren't as susceptible to overheating, and didn't require the water injection that the early 707s were known for. Not to be outdone by the British, Pratt & Whitney would respond to this leap from Rolls-Royce with their own turbofans, the Pratt & Whitney JT3D engine, that would later be retrofitted to existing 707s and DC-8s. So the British government agreed, and on the condition that Rolls-Royce would power the plane, in November 1956 they allowed the sale to BOAC to go through. Going a step further, BOAC set up an office at Boeing's facility in Renton, where the 707 was being made at the time. This brings us nicely over to the next point, certifying the airworthiness of the 707 from a British perspective. The United Kingdom at the time was uniquely positioned as being one of very few countries in the world that could conduct thorough airworthiness reviews. The British Air Registration Board, a predecessor to the British Civil Aviation Authority or CAA, sent certifiers and test pilots to the United States. Not only did the Federal Aviation Administration perform acceptance flights for every new plane that rolled off the production line, but BOAC and British certifiers did the same thing for theirs. The British, with their previous experience with the Comet, found that the plane did not exactly perform as desired, initially failing the aircraft for certification. They would request that Boeing make some changes to the plane if it was to ever see success across the pond. Perhaps the most notable of these fixes was the change to the vertical stabilizer, which was increased in length by about 1 meter to address insufficient levels of control the pilots had over the plane's rudder. Boeing complied, and this fix was retrofitted to existing 707s. They also found that the plane could easily over-rotate on takeoff, which could potentially follow through into a stall, this being something that British pilots had recognized from their experiences with the Comet. A ventral fin on the underside could be installed to help with this, though not all 707s had these. Then there was the curious oddity of the Boeing 707 doing something a bit strange. When the conditions are right, that is, flaps extended and high angle of attack, the plane would have this tendency to pitch upward close to the stall speed. This is believed to have been caused by the inward leading edge lifting devices holding onto more lift than expected in high angle of attack situations. British test pilots did not like this, and so they introduced a pitch augmentation system as part of the plane's anti-stalling measures, to bring the nose back down in such scenario. When the pilot pulls the flap lever to extend the flaps, it energizes an electrical system that, utilizing sensor vanes on the wings, communicates with the elevator control circuit to drive the control wheel in the cockpit forward. They called it the stick nudger. It nudged the stick. The stick nudger would only activate one time when the conditions are met, pilots could easily overcome it, and it was clearly laid out in operations manuals and training materials. So, no doubt, Boeing learned something here, and I'm sure never again did Boeing try to employ a pitch augmentation system as a method of addressing an oddly specific flight control characteristic as a way to get their plane certified. There's no way anything like that could possibly go wrong. Anyway, all of this is to say how we wound up with this variant of the plane, the Boeing 707-420. It's almost identical to the 320 model but fitted with the Rolls-Royce Conwy engines. It passed British certification in 1960 and BOAC began taking deliveries of this aircraft the same year. Golf Alpha Romeo Whiskey Echo was a 1962 built Boeing 707-420. Interestingly, it was originally not going to be delivered to BOAC. We're going to get back to them in just a moment. The accident aircraft was supposed to be destined for British Eagle Airways, and was initially registered in Bermuda as Victor Romeo Bravo Bravo Zulu. Eagle Airways was a British private non-government owned airline that was trying to break into the transatlantic business. Eagle Airways was awarded a license to operate between London and New York, which led them to place orders for 2 707s, much to the dismay of BOAC. In 1960, British Eagle had partnered with Cunard, who were busy trying to navigate the difficult ocean liner business in the dawn of the jet age. This partnership fell through in 1962 when their license was revoked, and BOAC went to Cunard themselves to set up their own joint venture, becoming BOAC Cunard, which lasted between the years of 1962 and 1966. And it's these titles you'll see in historical photographs of BOAC aircraft around this time. So, without the transatlantic route, Eagle Airways saw no use for the 707s, so Cunard took them to BOAC, including the accident aircraft, which was reliveried in BOAC Cunard colours and re-registered in Great Britain as Golf Alpha Romeo Whiskey Echo. Entering service in 1962, based at Heathrow Airport in London, Whiskey Echo would fly all over the world, across the Atlantic to the Americas, and even heading to far-flung destinations such as Australia and New Zealand. Although, following the separation of BOAC and Cunard in 1966, BOAC retained ownership of the plane. In November 1967, Whiskey Echo was involved in a very unusual and honestly foreboding incident in Honolulu, Hawaii. During the takeoff, the outer right number 4 engine suffered an uncontained engine failure via a turbine fracture. Debris was ejected from the engine in a way it punctured the nearby fuel tank. The subsequent outpouring of fuel ignited. Fortunately, the mishap was swiftly caught by the crew before reaching V1. Abandoning the takeoff, the pilots guided the plane onto a taxiway, bringing it to a stop. No fatalities were recorded, and the plane itself, though it had sustained some damage, was still salvageable as an airworthy aircraft. BOAC brought Whiskey Echo in for a major overhaul during the winter going into 1968. The right wing, of course, needed significant repair. On top of that, all of its engines were replaced. Moving onward to April 5th, 1968, Whiskey Echo had another engine change. Specifically, Engine 2 was swapped out. The engine that wound up being installed in its place was supposedly an overhauled or refurbished Conwy that met the standards of Rolls-Royce. However, this is complicated because the opportunity to catch this engine's fatal flaw had now been missed. Whiskey Echo was returned to service, and disaster would strike just 3 days later. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday, April 8th, 1968. Golf Alpha Romeo Whiskey Echo is parked on stand at Terminal 3 at Heathrow Airport, known at the time as the Oceanic Terminal, where most long-haul flights departed from. It's a beautiful day for flying, and it's busy as it usually is at Heathrow. Passengers are checking in for BOAC Flight 712, a journey from London all the way to Sydney, Australia. Depending on weather or en route delays, in 1968 this trip could take nearly 40 hours to complete. A number of intermediate stops need to be made en route: Zurich, Tel Aviv, Tehran, Bombay, Singapore, and Perth, and not every passenger is checking in for Australia. The Boeing 707 has a range of about 4,000 miles, so its own rate of fuel consumption necessitated these stopovers. 116 passengers have checked in at Heathrow, many of them British and Australian. Flight 712 is scheduled to depart at 4:15 in the afternoon, local time. A crew of 11 have turned up to work the flight. Let's break down the full list of crew members, beginning with the cockpit crew, of which there are a total of 5. Sitting in the left side captain's seat is 47-year-old Captain Charles Taylor, though to those who knew him, he was simply known as Cliff. A New Zealander, Captain Cliff Taylor has nearly 15,000 total flight hours of experience. A little over 1,500 of those hours were in BOAC's Boeing 707s. Across the aisle, over in the co-pilot right seat, is the senior first officer, 32-year-old Francis Brendan Kirkland. With over 5,000 flight hours of experience to his name, he has been on this plane for nearly twice as long as the captain, serving on the type for nearly 3,000 flight hours. The flight engineer is positioned behind the co-pilot. Here is where 35-year-old Thomas Hicks is stationed. When it comes to the 707, he was the least experienced member of crew on this occasion, though his flight hours amounted to nearly 6,500 in total. Now, the 707 can fly with just a crew of 3, but there are still 2 other pilots in the cockpit. The 30-year-old second officer John Hutchinson is acting first officer, but occupying the antiquated navigator's position as an observer. His main role on this flight is to monitor the crew. Mr. Hutchinson would notably later go on to have an extensive career at BOAC and later British Airways, eventually becoming a captain on the Concorde. Though here in his early career, he had only around 4,000 flight hours to his name by this point. Sitting in the other observer seat is 50-year-old Geoffrey Moss. He, like Captain Taylor, is a BOAC captain. His job on Flight 712 today is to run a route check on Captain Taylor. As a check captain, he is to ensure that the pilot flying is adhering to the company's standards of operation. He is strictly an observer and should have no role in decision-making or perform standard crew duties. Moving away from the cockpit and into the cabin, there are a total of 6 flight attendants working the flight. Stationed in the forward cabin is Andrew McCarthy and Rosalind Unwin, servicing first class. In the center of the cabin, working forward economy class, is the head flight attendant or chief steward Neville Davis Gordon. Today, he is working alongside stewardess Jennifer Suarez. These two are taking position in passenger seats 10D and 10E, nearby to the overwing exits. Jennifer held a rather unique crew position on this flight. She's a BOAC flight attendant usually based in Delhi, India. BOAC, on their long hauls, employed this custom of rostering a cabin crew member who was a national of one of the countries they'd visit on the journey. Jennifer, being Indian, was brought in to work this flight and fulfill this role. All the way in the back, working the aft galley, is Brian Taylor and one Barbara Jane Harrison. To those who knew her, she was simply known as Jane. Miss Jane Harrison was a bright young Yorkshire woman from Bradford and was just 22 years old. At BOAC, this made her one of the youngest flight attendants at the airline. It's a job she had been aspiring to for a while. Her bright and colourful character and her proficiency in French made her a suitable candidate for BOAC, who hired her in 1966. During her days off, when she wasn't working as a flight attendant, Jane worked part-time as a babysitter, and I have to tell you this because one of her clients was James Bond. Yeah, Sean Connery. I wasn't expecting that either. So, Jane lived an extraordinary life. She was well-travelled and even often requested to work the Australia route, which led some to rumour, including a close friend of hers, that she was secretly dating a Qantas pilot. Though, taking a step back, if you know anything about Speedbird 712, you likely already know about Harrison and her efforts, because of what is about to come. Her portrait is associated with the disaster for a reason, and it's something we'll circle back to later. It's 4 in the afternoon. Passengers are boarding, the crew preparing for departure. Outside, ground handlers are busy loading passenger baggage and other miscellaneous items such as mail into the cargo hold. The captain would also have been out here performing the walk-around of the aircraft. He takes a look at the plane's wings, quickly peering into the engines. Everything appears to look completely normal. 4:15. BOAC Flight 712 requests startup from the gate. They are given taxi instructions to head out to what was marked at the time as runway 28 left. That is, at Heathrow, the southerly runway departing to the west. Over in the control tower, the flight is in communication with tower controller John Davis. He is a pilot turned air traffic controller, and he has seen a lot in his time. In fact, he is still haunted by the memories of October 27th, 1965. It was a dark, foggy night as Davis tried to guide a British European Airways flight to the airport, but they kept missing the approach in the fog. Reportedly, the crew were tired and disoriented. The Vickers Vanguard crashed nearby the runway, killing all on board. Story for another time, perhaps. Today, he watches as the 707 is positioned onto the runway. Speedbird 712, runway 28 left, cleared for takeoff. Captain Cliff Taylor releases the brakes. Pushing the throttles forward, all 4 Rolls-Royce Conways spool up to power. Flight 712 lifts off from runway 28 left. It's a clean takeoff, performed with nobody suspecting anything was amiss. Captain Taylor calls for the landing gear to be retracted, and the wheels come up. The crew have performed the Heathrow departure many times, and in just a few moments they'll be reducing the engine power to conform with Heathrow's noise abatement procedure. This usually occurs about a minute or so into the flight, and it's something that Heathrow was and still is strict about. Although, before they even get there, this routine departure hits its abrupt end. Outside, deep within the number 2 engine, something gives way. The plane has been in the air for only 20 seconds. The explosion reverberates throughout the plane, unsettling the pilots, flight attendants, and passengers. No one has any clue as to what has happened, as the whole aircraft begins to vibrate. In these stunned moments of shock, passengers sitting on the left near the wing catch a glimpse of the horror unfolding outside. Stunned unease turns to terror as passengers begin to panic and shout, "The wing is on fire!" Hearing the distress of his passengers, head flight attendant Neville Davis Gordon takes proactive action. He gets up from his seat and begins making his way towards the front. Sitting nearby in a window seat with a clear view of the left wing is passenger Dr. Richard Haymond. He's a marine biologist by day, but a photographer by night. He pulls out his camera, capturing this photograph of the wing ablaze. The plane really is on fire, and it's not looking good. Up in the front, flight attendants Andrew McCarthy and Rosalind Unwin sort of glance at each other as if to say, "What the hell was that?" Andrew unfastens his seatbelt and cracks open the flight deck door, peeking inside. It's not good. Neville, now arriving up front, correctly interprets that an emergency landing returning to London is likely, so preparations should be made. Though, inside of the cockpit itself, it's chaos. The 5 pilots are trying to make sense of what has just happened. The situation is unclear right now as they're still climbing out of Heathrow. Flight 712 didn't have a cockpit voice recorder. It wasn't a requirement in 1968 and still wouldn't be for years. Because of this, how the flight crew reacted is therefore a little cloudy, and we must recognize that a lot was going on during this time. Nevertheless, we can piece parts of this back together based on the accounts from the surviving pilots as they spoke to investigators, journalists, and writers after the incident. Immediately following the explosion, Captain Taylor quickly finds, glancing over the engine readings, that parameters for engine 2 indicate rapid failure, and he closes the number 2 throttle. He orders the engine failure drill at this time. He's not exactly clued into the fire just yet. The engine failure drill and the engine fire drill are two separate procedures, but we are going to circle back to this in just a moment. The pilots are unaware of it, but Engine 2 just experienced a catastrophic uncontained engine failure. That is to say, the engine exploded, ejecting debris into the wing in a way that it just so happened to sever the fuel lines. As a consequence, a fire erupts as the wing is now hemorrhaging jet fuel. The fire is blisteringly hot. It's leaving behind a blazing trail of fire and smoke across the sky. Because the number 2 throttle was closed, coupled with the retracted landing gear, it causes the landing gear horn to sound, which sounds like this. There are cutoffs for these sorts of oral alerts. Recognizing that a situation has been confirmed, they can be switched off. Captain Taylor, Check Captain Moss, and First Officer Kirkland all reach for the cutoff switch to relieve them of the noise. Though you'd expect in this situation for there to be another sound. The sound of the fire bell, right? It sounds like this. Engine 2 is on fire. The fire bell should sound and be accompanied by a warning light in the corresponding engine's fire handle, found on the 707 at the center of the main panel. What appears to have happened is that when the pilots reached to cut off the landing gear horn, First Officer Kirkland inadvertently leant over to the fire bell cutoff. This may have been more of an instinctive action, as the fire bell cancel was pretty much right in front of him. Obviously, this had the effect of cutting off the ring of the fire bell for Engine 2. Later, when questioned, none of the pilots could recall hearing it. While it may have been possible that for a short time they weren't exactly clued into the existence of the fire if the warning light went unnoticed, its presence was quickly discovered when Check Captain Jeffrey Moss glanced out of the window nearest to where he was sitting. "Bloody hell, the wing is on fire!" he exclaims, stressing the need for an immediate landing and distress call. Moments later, First Officer Kirkland gets on frequency declaring Mayday. At the same time, Captain Taylor, now catching the fire warning light for Engine 2, now calls for the engine fire drill. So, it's here that a bit of a breakdown occurred. Let's try and see if we can piece together what exactly happened here. When Captain Taylor initially called for the engine failure drill, the responsibility to execute it fell to Flight Engineer Thomas Hicks. It contains a series of memory items that crew members memorize as part of their training to execute immediately. After all, time is very much of the essence in these situations. The flight engineer, naturally, executes the instructions from the captain and begins following the items on this checklist. Though, during this time, he had a clear view of the main panel. The flight engineer leant in to pull the fire shutoff handle, but instead resisted. He's not doing a fire drill, and pulling the handle is not an item in the standard engine failure drill. And, well, as we have established, there was no ring of the fire bell, which may have contributed to some confusion. But let's now take a look at the fire drill. The engine fire drill is split into two parts. Phase 1 is, again, memory items that are to be executed immediately from the crew, and is similar to the steps outlined in the regular failure drill. That said, Phase 1 of the fire drill has the notable inclusion of this item: fire shutoff. Pull. When the fire shutoff handle is pulled, it does a few things. It energizes a fire extinguishing system, closes the fuel shutoff valve, and trips the generator of the associated engine. Now, what appears to have happened is that when the captain ordered the fire drill, the flight engineer obviously pivoted over to that. Though he evidently missed actioning the fire handle step, and we know this because later analysis of the wreckage revealed that the Engine 2 fire handle would not ever be pulled during the crisis, and Phase 2 of the checklist does not require any verification of the previous steps. Consequently, without fuel shutoff, fuel is being pumped directly into the inferno. The failure to correctly address the fire came at the confluence of confusion between checklists, lack of information, a high-stress environment, and shortcomings in the procedures themselves that rely so heavily on memory. And with other crew members all doing different things, the captain flying the plane, the first officer on the radios, the second officer in no position to see much of what was going on, and the check captain was actually looking out of the window at the wing and passing information to the captain. No one was able to cross-reference or communicate with the flight engineer who made this glaring omission. Then, by the time that someone did check in, it looked as if the fire drill was complete, when in fact a key step was missed, and the fire shut-off handle goes unpulled. Captain Taylor still has control of the airplane, though it is a wounded bird. He starts navigating, turning the plane to the left. Back in the control tower, controller John Davis watched as he witnessed from afar the disintegration of the problematic engine. Anticipating a return to the airport, he immediately hits the crash button, alerting emergency services. He starts clearing the airspace, getting on frequency to instruct arriving aircraft to overshoot. That's the now antiquated term for go-around. Davis initially expected a return to runway 28 left, the same runway and direction they had just departed from. The issue with the runway 28 left arrival is that Flight 712 would have to stay in the air for longer, circling the airport to line back up with the runway. It could take several minutes. With one of their wings on fire, it's time they simply do not have, and the crew recognize this. Their wing could break apart at any point. So, let's take a look at their options for a return to Heathrow. We know that runway 28 left is an option, but would require some time. Looking at their current position relative to the airport, the other extreme here would be to turn back directly to the runway, landing in the opposite direction. I mean, it would be technically correct to say that runway 10 right is their nearest runway after all. Well, this would require a very difficult turn of over 180 degrees. There is a lot to consider with this sort of maneuver in a very short space of time. How far are you away from the airport? Can you turn the plane in time to line up with the runway again? There may be wind conditions to consider. Are you going from a strong headwind to a sudden tailwind? Turning the plane so sharply could put a lot of stress on the already damaged wing, and with the loss of an engine could enable loss of control. A 180-degree turn to the right would also likely result in an overshoot of runway 10 left, the northern runway. Engine 2 is the one that failed. Asymmetrical thrust naturally pushing the plane left, turning limitations brought on by the failure itself, and the fact that this is a Boeing 707 doing upwards of 200 knots, this would probably limit the feasibility of this maneuver too. It is therefore incredibly fortunate that there just so happens to be another option for Speedbird 712. The London Heathrow Airport that we know today features one set of two parallel runways, marked runway 09 left, 27 right, and 09 right, 27 left. Runway 27 left is the same runway 28 left Whiskey Echo departed from during the accident flight. The numbering was changed in the years in between. Although, take a look at this aerial image of Heathrow Airport from 1968. It has some recognizable features of the airport of today. The terminal complex is in the center, and the same two parallel runways are to the north and south. Heathrow Airport in its original layout had no less than 6 runways that surrounded the airport. Over time, these runways were decommissioned, as expansion necessitated the space these runways occupied. 5 of these runways remained in 1968. There's the two we've already mentioned, one northwest to southeast runway, and one other set of 2 parallel runways running northeast to southwest. The orientation of these runways opened up a convenient opportunity for Speedbird 712. Captain Taylor and his crew elect the use of runway 05 right for emergency landing. Emergency services were notified, though getting firefighters into position was a difficult task in and of itself. The main fire station at Heathrow is on the north side of the airport, beyond the northern runway in fact. Though the emergency had been received in the station, controller John Davis is still trying to clear the airport of traffic. In the meantime, the trucks can't cross the active runway, so they have to wait. In other words, they're stuck in traffic. There is a substation to the south, close by to runway 05 right. They mobilize into position, but their equipment is limited. Now executing a large left-hand turn, Flight 712 is navigating firstly over the village of Wraysbury. Fragments of Engine 2's cowling and internal components were later found here. Continuing their turn, the plane passes over the River Thames, bringing Whiskey Echo overhead to the village of Thorpe at 3,000 feet at a speed of 225 knots. The plane has been in the air for about 1 minute and 40 seconds. The uncontrolled fire reaches breaking point, literally. Engine 2 has been subject to scorching heat for about 90 seconds. The engine pylon is weakened. Number 2 separates from the wing and falls to the ground. It lands in a water-filled gravel pit just outside of Thorpe. The sight of the burning plane catches the attention of bystanders on the ground. The first phone calls go out to 999. Concerned residents report parts falling off an airplane. One Thorpe resident happened to have a camera on them. Pointing it skyward, they captured this terrifying photograph. The flight crew are unaware of this. They are currently busy bringing out the flaps and landing gear in preparation for a swift arrival back at Heathrow. Engine 2 was all but useless to them, and its detachment shows no changes on the engine gauges, though the absence of the burning engine causes the fire warning light to cease. The wing is still ablaze. Jet fuel is still being pumped into the inferno. Passengers in the cabin are also feeling the heat. Neville is in the forward cabin with Andrew and Rosalind. Jennifer is on the PA repeating the emergency and evacuation procedures over and over again to passengers. The heat, however, is becoming unbearable in some parts of the cabin. Passengers are leaning away and getting up from their seats to relieve them of the heat of the fire. The windows and fuselage skin are beginning to melt, as if the plane could break apart at any moment. Back in the cockpit, Captain Taylor is trying to line the stricken aircraft up with 05 right. He is high and fast, and this is a runway that is not normally used at Heathrow. It has no sort of instrument guidance. The plane doesn't have much time left. He absolutely needs to safely land the plane on the one shot he has here. The fate of the lives of all on board depend on it. Up till now, he has been able to control the aircraft with relative ease, all things considered. Though once Engine 2 fell away from the plane, it opened a massive hole in the wing, and hydraulic fluid is also escaping. It's now manifesting in a progressive deterioration of the flight controls. Captain Taylor orders the flaps to the full 50-degree position, though they fail and become frozen. Flight 712 is now passing over the village of Stanwell, immediately south of Heathrow Airport. They are seconds from touchdown. Check Captain Jeffrey Moss picks up the public address system and announces to the cabin to expect an imminent emergency landing, though it largely went unheard. All flight attendants return to their stations. Andrew and Rosalind are in the front and will coordinate evacuation via the forward exits. Neville and Jennifer return to the center. They don't know what is to come yet, but their job won't be as straightforward, knowing that the left wing is being consumed by flames. Brian and Barbara are in the back and will coordinate evacuation via the aft exits. All of them are prepared to leap into action at a moment's notice. They know that this is a life-threatening situation, and for that reason the evacuation will begin as soon as possible, with or without orders from the flight deck. It's been a little over 3 minutes since BOAC 712 left Heathrow. Utilizing his thousands of hours of flight experience, Captain Taylor lowers the plane to the runway. Remarkably, it's a textbook landing. He applies reverse thrust, and to his relief, he discovers the plane still has brakes, and Whiskey Echo slows to a crawl. Notwithstanding, the plane may be on the ground, but things are far from over. Whiskey Echo is slowing down and is a little over halfway down the runway. Before the plane even comes to a stop, the center cabin flight attendants leap from their seats for the nearest doors. Neville and Jennifer both take aim at the right side overwing exits. They know already that the left side is impassable. The 707 does eventually come to a standstill, the wing still on fire. Emergency services are moving in. Firefighters from the substation roll onto the runway behind the plane, positioning themselves behind the aircraft. But those from the main fire station are not here yet. The pilots turn their focus towards shutting the plane down. Fuel is still flowing throughout the aircraft. The pumps, electrics, and hydraulics are still engaged. Flight engineer Hicks jumps in, switching the start levers to cutoff. Captain Taylor calls for the fire procedure on the remaining engines, though the plane wouldn't last long enough for them to complete it. Back in the cabin, passengers are already escaping via the right side overwings. Neville even climbs onto the wing to assist a passenger who had become lost. He quickly heads back inside to assist Jennifer. The forward and aft cabin crews now initiate their evacuation. Andrew and Rosalind successfully open both the forward left passenger door and the forward right service door. Now, the emergency slides of the day differ from those of modern times. They need to be handled into position and manually inflated by pulling a cord. The slide on the right inflates as normal, but Rosalind is having some difficulty inflating the left slide. She pulls the cord to find that it immediately breaks. She would later be told that the internal inflation mechanism may have become broken over many flights, so inflation may have failed or been impossible in this condition. Meanwhile, in economy class, Brian and Barbara look through the aft left passenger door. It's looking precarious out there. The burning wing is only meters away. Flaming puddles of jet fuel that have leaked from the aircraft scatter the ground. They elect to keep this door closed. Opening the aft right galley door, the emergency slide inflates, but they too are having some difficulty. The evacuation has barely begun, when suddenly, the main fuel tank inside of the left wing explodes. A massive fireball erupts and a towering cloud of black smoke now looms over Heathrow Airport. It's only one of multiple explosions, and 100 people are still inside. The first responding firefighters are overwhelmed. They don't have the equipment for this. Coming from the small substation, they only have a couple of foam tenders and a hose, and the main firefighting force is still not here yet. The explosion shudders the entire plane, weakening the structural integrity of the fuselage. Noxious smoke bellows through into the cabin. The flooring becomes bent and insecure. A frenzy of panicked passengers pushing and shoving their way through the cabin knocks some to the floor. Vulnerable passengers fall victim to the stampede. Some are elderly, some are disabled. Children are ripped from the grasp of their families. In the cockpit, Captain Taylor realizes there is no time. He abandons the duties of the flight deck and calls for immediate evacuation. In other words, they abandon ship. The 5 men relieve themselves from their seats and head back into the cabin to assist the cabin crew. When they open the door, they are met with a devastating scene. The fuselage is filling with thick black smoke. They can't even see the other end of the cabin. Flight attendants are pushing and shoving apprehensive passengers straight out of the door. The situation is deteriorating rapidly. They have about a minute, if they are lucky, to get everyone out. We just pushed and shoved passengers out, generally without cabin baggage, about a body every second. Some passengers remained calm. I recall seeing a poor lady at the bottom of the chute. She just stood there and wet herself. One of the aircraft's tires was rolling towards another lady passenger. A fireman helped her away, and another managed to divert the tire's course of rolling. Whilst all of this was going on, the aircraft exploded 3 or 4 times. Smoke now shrouds the right wing. Neville and Jennifer cease their evacuation. They can't in good conscience send people through here now. Instead, they direct passengers to the forward exits. It's getting crowded up here. Second Officer Hutchinson helps Andrew and Rosalind marshalling passengers out of the door. Meanwhile, Captain Taylor and Flight Engineer Hicks notice the forward left slide lays uninflated. The captain attempts to inflate it, whilst Hicks jumps down to the runway to try and straighten it out, with little luck. One passenger wound up flinging himself straight out of the same door, breaking a few bones on the way down. He almost takes the captain out with him. That passenger happened to be a Polish-born man by the name of Katriel Katz, an Israeli diplomat and former Israel ambassador to Poland and later the Soviet Union. Katz and the flight engineer were the only people to escape via the forward left. The vast majority of passengers rapidly escape at the forward right. First Officer Kirkland prepares an alternate exit via the flight deck. He opens the co-pilot side window and begins lowering a rope to the ground. As the flow of passengers begins to slow, Jeffrey Moss slides into an opening and escapes. When it appears that all, or at least most passengers had left, the crew themselves leave the plane. Neville, Andrew, Jennifer, and Rosalind all leave through the forward service door. Captain Taylor, First Officer Kirkland and Second Officer Hutchinson are the last crew members to leave the plane. They lean into first class, shouting into the cabin. It's overwhelming, and with no response, it is assumed that the last had evacuated. The 3 pilots then leave through the cockpit window, sliding down the rope. Crew members, firefighters, and airport staff meet them on the ground and begin a head count, revealing the worst. Not everyone is accounted for. A number of people are still missing. Fumes had separated the aft crew from the rest of the group. Setting up the escape chute on the aft right came with some difficulty as it had become tangled. Brian jumps down to the runway to straighten it out. However, they only manage to get a handful of passengers out before nearby sparks ignite the chute. It deflates and is destroyed. Brian realizes he can't get back up to help. Barbara Jane and the remaining passengers in the rear are left stranded. They are surrounded by noxious smoke and no escape slide. Harrison is trapped up here, but she still has desperate passengers who need to get out, including a child. She has no time and needs to act immediately. She encourages them to jump, but some hesitate. She's got no choice, and she gives them a push out the door. Though they may have fallen to the runway and maybe even sustained injury, she saves lives by doing this. Around a dozen or so people escape through the aft galley door. According to witnesses on the day, the lone flight attendant was last seen in the gangway of the aft galley door, supposedly looking as if she was readying to jump herself at any moment. Captain Taylor comes round the back and is pleading with her to jump. Except, she is the one hesitating. There are still 4 people inside the burning plane. She backs away from the edge and re-enters the cabin. 24-year-old Catherine Shearer was an Australian school teacher heading home. She was travelling with her mum, who did manage to escape in the evacuation. What happened is unclear, but she may have struggled to climb over the passenger seating or other passengers. Jacqueline Cooper was just 8 years old. She was in the process of emigrating to Australia with her family. She had become lost and separated from her parents and 2 brothers in the evacuation. Seated all the way in the back of the cabin were 2 elderly passengers. Mary Smith was recently widowed and was travelling to visit family in Australia. Esther Cohen had come all the way from Argentina and was transiting through Heathrow, continuing her journey home. Mrs. Cohen was a wheelchair user who required assistance to move. Obviously, she wasn't able to evacuate without assistance, and so far, no one has come to help her. Having now re-entered the cabin, the stewardess tries to save whomever she can find. Maybe she knew there were others. Perhaps before jumping she could recall the woman in the wheelchair. Maybe she could hear cries for help coming from within the smoke. Whatever the case, it is clear from her actions that Harrison couldn't bring herself to jump when there were others still to be saved. The remains of the 5 people were later found in the charred skeleton of the plane at the very back of the cabin, scattered nearby the door. We don't exactly know what happened in the cabin during these moments. It's unknowable. That said, Harrison's and Cohen's remains were found close together, indicating that Harrison had tried to save her. What we do know is that all 5 had succumbed and died from smoke inhalation. In the span of less than 10 minutes, Whiskey Echo had become a smouldering wreck, burning out on Heathrow's runway 05 right. Firefighters and emergency services did eventually contain the fire, but not without assistance from stations in nearby Hounslow. Ultimately, they were successful in containing the spread of the fire to the right starboard fuel tanks. An investigation did reveal shortcomings in the response of Heathrow's emergency services, implicating poor communication as a factor in the slow response. This was only exacerbated by the fact that the main fire station was located so far away from the burning aircraft on the north side of the airport, requiring them to cross a busy runway. All the while, substation responders were ill-equipped, their equipment broke, and firemen struggled with nearby hydrants. When responders from the main station did arrive, by that point the evacuation had reached its endpoint. It's important to recognize that these shortcomings came about in the context of a rapidly changing airport. For example, the equipment that was employed was antiquated. Aviation had changed a lot in the previous decade or so. Equipment that was introduced in the 1950s when planes were smaller were beginning to fall out of favor as planes got bigger, and the potential for large-scale fires only grew with that. Recognizing that the launch of the gargantuan Boeing 747 was just around the corner, it was urgent that changes needed to be made to prepare Heathrow Airport for any potential future emergency, like the one of Speedbird 712. Training was revised, their equipment overhauled, and though the old station continued operation for years after, a new one was eventually constructed in the early 1990s. As the news broke of the incident, it was quickly recognized that though 5 people lost their lives, this accident could have easily have had a very different outcome. We needn't look further than 2 years ahead to find an example of that alternate conclusion. On July 5th, 1970, the wing of an Air Canada DC-8 caught fire following a hard landing and engine separation during a go-around at Toronto. Much like Speedbird 712, the DC-8's fuel lines had become ruptured, creating an inferno that swallowed the wing. The right wing exploded about 3 minutes later whilst they were still in the air. The pilots lost all control and any hope of survival in that instant. The plane with 109 people on board spiraled into the ground. If you'd like to learn more about that case, I already have that video prepared for you. As to how this speaks to the case of Flight 712, well, simply, they were lucky that the airport layout of the time enabled a quicker arrival. If they had gone through with the return to runway 28 left, they mightn't have made it. It is for that reason that the flight crew and flight attendants were recognized for their efforts in not only landing the plane but also evacuating. Most passengers had actually escaped within 90 seconds, which aligns well with the evacuation standards of today. Newspaper headlines vastly praised the pilots. Everyone wanted to speak to the Queen's captain who saved over 100 people. Captain Taylor, though, was quick to highlight that it was very much a team effort. He couldn't have done it without his flight crew or cabin crew. The disaster was subject to discussion in Parliament the next day, and the investigation was opened. The Board of Trade's Accidents Investigation Branch would conduct the investigation, spearheaded by one Anthony Crossland, Labour MP for Great Grimsby. From there, we really need to ask the question that lays at the centre of this. What caused Engine 2 to fail in the first place? We must go all the way back to those Rolls-Royce Conwy engines. The failure that occurred came from deep within. Now, the problem engine was salvaged from the gravel pit nearby Thorpe, but investigators also discovered several other pieces of debris, including internal components in areas nearby, where the plane had flown over. Analysis of these fragments revealed telltale signs of fatigue, implicating low-pressure compressor wheel number 5 as the culprit. Just so we are all on the same page here, the compressor inside of the engine is the phase in which air that has been brought into the engine is, well, compressed, in that air is funneled through an increasingly narrower shaft, raising the pressure and temperature of the gases in preparation for entry into the combustion chamber. Hang on, I just realized, I can just show you. Come join me, let's go on a journey, let's head to my hometown. Welcome to Newcastle. I've come to the Discovery Museum, which is a small science museum in Newcastle, which just so happens to have a cutaway model of a Rolls-Royce Conwy. I can literally just point to you what exactly failed. I have shown this before in a previous 2023 video, but it's more relevant here, and to be clear, this Conwy engine was sourced from a former BOAC, later British Airways Vickers VC-10. The Conwy was also used to power that plane too, and we have one of them right here. Okay, this is the part where I need to keep it 100 with you. All jet engines follow the same principle and will generally have similar anatomy. When we're talking about this low-pressure compressor wheel, we're referencing one of these, a wheel of blades. Simple enough. This is where investigators pinned the point of failure in their report. Or at least, it is a similar component, as this model may be slightly different to that used on the 707. Metal fatigue had worn it down to the point of disintegration. When the engines were powered up on that fateful flight, the stress brought on by the high power had accelerated the fatigue to breaking point, expending its energy in the form of an uncontained engine failure. The compressor came apart, damaging other internal components, before bursting through the engine housing. The unpredictability of such an event had sent debris outward in a way it happened to align with conflict with the fuel manifold, the fuel supply lines. Thus, an uncontained engine failure brought about the disastrous events of Flight 712. That said, the lore behind this engine goes a bit deeper though. If you remember, Engine 2 had been fitted onto the aircraft just a matter of days before the accident. However, the problem engine had some history. It wasn't new. Rolls-Royce had built it back in 1961. For a few years it operated normally, but upon receiving a refurbishment in March 1965, pilots began reporting problems with it. Mainly, the engine had this tendency to vibrate quite a lot. So, in May 1965, it was removed, opened up, and mechanics reportedly discovered fracturing of the engine's compressor fan blades. High-pressure compressor stage 8 was found to be the problem there. The engine was repaired and returned to service again. In October 1967, the engine was back in the BOAC workshop for repairs, and this time, the low-pressure compressor was supposedly removed and overhauled. Compressor wheel 5, an original part, went back into the same compressor, and crucially, at no point were any crack or fatigue detection methods employed. It wasn't a requirement. A month later, the engine was tested, and BOAC failed it on the grounds that it still continued to excessively vibrate. So, how did it end up on the plane? Well, though the engine may have failed according to BOAC's limits, the manufacturer, Rolls-Royce, disagreed. They had different thresholds and standards, and the engine passed testing according to them. So, BOAC made an exception on this occasion and accepted the engine anyway. Jet engines do require a lot of maintenance, and the early jets of the 1950s and 1960s suffered from the natural teething problems that come in the dawn of a new technology. As it happened, the accident engine was then reinstalled onto one of Whiskey Echo's sister planes, only for it to be pulled again for repair. By that point, Whiskey Echo was in the shop for an engine change, and on April 5, 1968, it was installed at the engine 2 position. 3 days later, stage 5 of the low-pressure compressor failed, and the engine exploded. The final report was published in April 1969. Investigators naturally outlined multiple factors. While the captain was commended for his airmanship in landing the plane, the investigation did touch upon human error in their causal statement. The accident resulted from an omission to close the fuel shutoff valve, when the number 2 engine caught fire following the failure of its number 5 low-pressure compressor wheel. The failure of the wheel was due to fatigue. It was identified that the engine failure and fire procedures could be easily confused in high-stress environments. Investigators called for BOAC to review their procedures carefully, emphasizing sequence of operation and allocation of responsibility in emergency drills. BOAC combined the two into one checklist, and changes were made to pilot training to ensure that items are clearly read out. The Boeing 707's emergency slides were also criticized for their flammability. The report called for further studies into potential materials that could be used to improve heat and flame resistance, whilst also stressing that the slides must be easily deployable for swift evacuation. BOAC formally recognized Captain Taylor and most of his crew. All of them received commendations from the airline with the notable exception of flight engineer Thomas Hicks, who, well, did not. All flight crew members continued to fly after the accident. Investigators did look to the flight attendants to ensure that their efforts did not go unnoticed. Little time was available for the cabin staff to prepare the passengers for the landing and subsequent evacuation. Nevertheless, from the mass of favourable comments from the passengers and the evidence available, it is clear that everything possible was done, and the cabin staff, under the leadership of the chief steward, behaved with commendable coolness and efficiency throughout. In recognition of their efforts, in August 1969, Queen Elizabeth II awarded the air traffic controller and 2 flight attendants with royal recognition. The flight crew, in wake of the final report, would not receive any recognitions from the government or monarch. John Davis was awarded the Order of the British Empire for clearing the airport of traffic, allowing Whiskey Echo an opportunity to land. He continued to work as an air traffic controller, transferring to Gatwick Airport in the 1980s, where he was promoted to a manager's position. The chief steward, head flight attendant Neville Davis Gordon, due to his unwavering professionalism in the face of life-threatening injury, received the British Empire Medal for gallantry. He accepted it on behalf of the entire Speedbird 712 crew. The George Cross for gallantry was posthumously awarded to the fallen flight attendant Barbara Jane Harrison. Her story and final sacrifice to save others touched the nation. The president of the Board of Trade, Anthony Crossland, who spearheaded the investigation, later wrote citing Harrison's efforts as lonely, courageous action. Harrison is the only woman to receive the honour in peacetime. Her father accepted the George Cross. In more recent years, Harrison received a blue plaque in her name, which is displayed on Bolton Road in Bradford, nearby to her former home. Her name is forever etched in stone. Her sacrifice, putting the lives of others above her own, will never be forgotten. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. Apologies for sounding a little under the weather during this Patreon outro. I'm not sure what happened today. I opened the window and the pollen just hit me like a brick. But we are just going to power through this and we are going to round off this video like we always do, so let's go. I have to say, this one has been an interesting one to look at. It wasn't a case I was all too familiar with until it came on my radar about a year or so ago. So it's been good to finally get round to it. I'd like to give recognition to one of the more notable works about BOAC 712, the book titled Fire Over Heathrow by Susan Ottaway. One thing I always try to remember about older cases like this one is that works by people like Susan are really extraordinary, in that because time is limited, many of the survivors are no longer with us to tell their story. Like, this happened nearly 60 years ago at this point. The book was written nearly 20 years ago at this point as well. It really puts things into perspective because when you think about it, there really is limited time to learn all that we can from accidents like these. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Susan Ottaway for her contribution and journalism. And the book, by the way, is well worth your time to seek out, especially if you'd like to learn more than what we have looked at here today. I'll leave a link in the description of this video and also at the top of the references document attached to this video. That said, it's time to pay some bills and take a moment to thank the incredible Patreon supporters who have generously contributed to the channel. Their support is greatly appreciated and goes a long way in keeping my work independent and right now also sponsor-free. So I really can't thank them enough, and it's their names that are scrolling on the screen right now. So, some shoutouts. Firstly, we'll begin with the business class tier, so in no particular order, thanks goes out to Natalie Garrett, Neil Johnson, Emma Montrose, Ryan Foxley, and Rough Unity 01. Thank you all so much. And then a big special thanks goes out to the first class tier patrons, Elodie Lilith, Priest137, and Alexandria. What absolute legends, thank you all so very much. If you, yourself, would like to support the channel further, you can always join my patrons over on Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new videos 2 days before they go out publicly. Well then, that is it from me today. I am going to get out of here. I am going back to Denmark now to spend some time with my girlfriend, so if you'd like to keep up with my ongoings, you can always join my socials, which are also in the pinned comment. In the meantime, I will see you all later. And until the next video, goodbye.